is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Leaders of the world's 20 major economies end their summit in Bali, a gathering overshadowed by Ukraine. China's president calls for the international community to work together to resolve the world's challenges.
Our other headlines: Poland's president says there's no sign of a deliberate attack from Russia after a missile killed 2 people on a farm near the border with Ukraine.
The highest inflation rate in 41 years. UK households and businesses face a steep rise in prices, driven by energy and the cost of food.
Some of the world's best-known companies are told to avoid Twitter by their marketing bosses as the advertising boycott of the company gathers pace.
And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
And fly me to the moon. NASA launches its most powerful rocket from Cape Canaveral in Florida.
The gathering of the leaders of the world's largest economy, the G20, has come to an end in Bali.
In a summit overshadowed by the events in Ukraine, China's president has called for countries to work together to resolve the world's challenges and differences and to use digital technology to fix the post-pandemic recovery.
Our correspondent Dong Shui reports.
The summit has concluded with a leader's declaration. Economic-wise, the central banks will continue to appropriately calibrate the pace of the money policy, tightening in a data-dependent and clearly, communicated manner. While limiting cross-country spillovers, central bank independence is crucial to achieving price stability, buttressing monetary policy credibility. And also, countries must take temporary and targeted measures to help sustain purchasing power of most vulnerable, cushioning the impact of commodity price increase as well. President Xi Jinping also met with the UN head Antonio Guterres on the sidelines of G20 summit, where Mr. Xi stressed that China will firmly support international system with the UN as the core, and the United Nations firmly support the One China principle, which is and red line must be respected. Mr. Guterres then said UN is ready to continue close cooperation with China. Also earlier during the third working session at the discussions on the digital transformation, President Xi had also made his remarks pointing out that the growing scale of the digital economy and the accelerating digital transformation across the globe have become important factors affecting the world economic landscape. When hosting the G20 Hangzhou summit, China included digital economy in the G20 agenda for the first time and called for finding innovative ways for development and forging new growth drivers. And in recent years, the G20 has built more consensus and stepped up cooperation on adapting to digital transformation and building the digital economy. It is hoped that all parties will unleash the dynamism in digital cooperation and bring the benefits of digital economy to the people of all countries.
Dong Shui reporting from Bali.
After the G20 summit, President Xi met his Indonesian counterpart, Joko Widodo. The two leaders oversaw the trial run of the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway. The China-built project will shorten the journey between Indonesia's 2 major cities from more than 3 hours to 40 minutes. The two sides have agreed on more cooperation on building infrastructure, the digital economy and COVID vaccine development.
Well, leaders of the G20 major economies say that they deplore in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The summit's second day was over by that explosion in Poland, thought to have been caused by a stray missile. The war in Ukraine had already dominated the meeting, and the final statement says most members condemn the war. It says the war is causing human suffering and exacerbating fragilities in the global economy.
Poland has said there is no evidence that Tuesday's missile explosion in the country was an attack by Russia.
Speaking after an emergency security meeting in Warsaw, President Andrzej Duda says the strike was probably an unfortunate incident, rather than a planned strike. 2 people were killed in the missile strike that hit a farm 6 kilometers from the Ukrainian border.
Well, in a moment, we'll be talking to our correspondents in Kyiv and in Tallinn. But first of all, let's go to Poland and talk to our correspondent, Trent Murray. So, Trent, what more has been said after this meeting?
Well, Robin, President Duda has really spent much of the day effectively just trying to bring down the temperature a little bit, if you will. Of course, it comes after a night, really, where there was a lot of rumours running rife that it was potentially a Russian missile which struck Polish territory, and all of the issues that would have come with that, namely a potential triggering of NATO's collective defence mechanisms. But President Duda has said after investigations, it now does appear that that rocket was part of Ukraine's defence arsenal, the missiles used to try and shoot down Russian rockets. Of course, we know Russia launched a major barrage of rockets against Ukraine on Tuesday, and it seems that one of the missiles used to try and defend their skies has managed to somehow either be strayed or veered off course and landed about 6 kilometres away from the Ukrainian border. President Duda has said in the past few hours that there is no evidence that it was an intentional attack on Poland. It is highly probable the rocket was from Ukraine's side, and there was no proof that it was launched by Russia. For that reason, now we do expect the military, which had been put on a heightened alert, to now be brought back down to a more regular level. We also do know, though, however, as part of these really delicate couple of hours on diplomatic discussions, that the Russian ambassador was hauled into the foreign ministry here. We know, according to a spokesperson, that meeting between the Polish and the Russian sides only lasted for 4 minutes. There were no handshakes given. I think it's a clear sign that relations still do remain very frosty between Central Europe and Russia.
So NATO held an emergency meeting in Brussels earlier. How are Poland's allies responding?
Yeah, that's right. That meeting called by Poland after what happened, of course, when news first broke. There was just so much uncertainty around the source of this missile, but that discussion still took place today despite the growing body of evidence that it wasn't an intentional attack. But what we are hearing really from a lot of other NATO members is, whilst this may have been a Ukrainian missile, they're not really laying the blame at Kyiv, saying this instead is a tragic accident. In fact, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was speaking about this earlier today, and he said regardless of where the missile came from, this is still Russia's fault because it was the one that attacked Ukraine. A similar message from the French, Macron, saying that utmost caution needs to be used on the origin of the missile. Of course, the man really at the centre of a lot of this is the head of NATO, who chaired that meeting, Jens Stoltenberg. Let's have a listen to what he had to say after that meeting of the alliance.
An investigation into this incident is ongoing, and we need to await its outcome. But we have no indication that this was the result of a deliberate attack. This is most likely Ukrainian air defense systems or missiles, but again, this is not Ukraine's fault.
And from Kyiv's perspective in all of this, they are now asking for access to the crash site to help form part of the investigation. The Poles are saying tonight that the only way that will happen is with agreement between Warsaw and Washington. We understand the investigation into this missile strike very much being led by the Polish and the Americans.
Trent Murray in Warsaw, thank you very much.
Well, President Zelensky says Ukraine holds Russia responsible for that missile explosion in Poland. Zelensky has called the incident a very significant escalation of the conflict. Let's talk now to our correspondent, Shamim Chowdhury in Kyiv. Shamim, this missile looks to have perhaps been accidental rather than an act of deliberate aggression, but that's not accepted by the sound of it in Ukraine.
Absolutely not. Vladimir Zelensky has pointed the finger squarely at Russia, and he said it shouldn't really come as much of a surprise. He says that he described it as an act of terrorism. He said that Russia has been acting with impunity, not just in this incident, but as far as the entire conflict in Ukraine is concerned. And he also pointed to neighbouring countries like Moldova, saying they too are under threat. He also stressed the need for collective security and said that neighbouring countries, EU countries, need to come together to make a firm stand against Russia's actions. Now, we've just heard that the presidential office is also requesting access to the site of the attack in eastern Poland, very close to the Ukrainian border. He's saying that the Ukrainians want to find out for themselves exactly where the missile came from and where the responsibility lies. He, of course, extended his sympathy to the Polish people and to the Polish president. But as far as he's concerned, there is only one person to blame, and that is Vladimir Putin.
If this incident was accidental, Ukraine has endured a day of missile strikes, which obviously are not. We're hearing of more air raid warnings today.
That's right. There have been several air raid warnings today and a few through the night as well. But really, the country's Air Force defence have been scrambling over the past 24 hours to get the electricity back up and running. The power outages, as a direct result of the 90 or so missile strikes pan-Ukraine, across the entire country, caused 10 million people to go without power. Now, although we are being told that 8 million people do have power now, it has been restored, but we understand that we understand that 15 power stations were completely destroyed, many more partially destroyed. Some of them have been repaired. In certain parts of the country, Kyiv, for example, the region as well as the city, Odessa in the south, Chernigov in the north, they now have power, we understand. The regions and the cities themselves. However, in the west, Lviv, the city has power, but many of the suburban areas don't. Sumy and Kharkiv in the east. So it's very much an ongoing situation in terms of restoring normality here. The officials in Lviv are saying that in order to get Lviv back how it was, up and running smoothly, it's going to take 8 months. So very much the result of yesterday's strikes we are very much seeing a continuation of them here in Ukraine.
Shamim, thank you for that. Our correspondent Shamim Chowdhury in Ukraine.
Russia has denied any involvement in Tuesday's missile strike on Poland. Moscow praised what it called restraint from US President Joe Biden after he said there was no indication the missile came from Russia. But Moscow has accused Poland and some of its allies of responding hysterically to the incident. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Giles Gibson in Tallinn. So, Giles, this looks like an accident and not an act of aggression as originally suspected.
That's right, and in the early hours after these reports first emerged from the very far east of Poland, we saw the Kremlin really issuing a very strong denial, saying that there was no link to the Russian Ministry of Defense, to the Russian military whatsoever. And we've seen that throughout the course of Wednesday as well from Dmitry Peskov, who is the spokesperson for the Russian president, saying that there'd been another hysterical Russophobic reaction that hasn't been based on any facts. As you mentioned, he also had some very rare praise indeed for the United States, saying that the US government, that the US had shown restraint in terms of its response to these reports coming out of the east of Poland. I think what we will see there, and what we've already been hearing actually from Trent, for example, in Poland, is that Ukraine's allies, Western allies, will make the point that even if it does turn out to have been a Ukrainian air defense system missile that landed over the Polish border, that this chain of events was only really started by the fact that Russia unleashed that massive bombardment of cities all over Ukraine.
Giles, thank you very much. Our correspondent Giles Gibson.
Let's talk to Mark Cansian, Senior Advisor at Washington Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mark, welcome. Good to have your company. In the cold light of day, the situation is now calmer and collected than a few hours ago. But this Poland missile incident looked like the brink of something pretty terrible. From what we now know, where does this stray missile strike, or whatever this incident turns out to be? What does it say about the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, one good thing about this incident is the calm and measured support, measured response that the U.S. and NATO took. Both of them decided to get the facts first. They did not immediately take action. And then when the facts came out, it was clear that this was some sort of accident. It could have escalated if they had not been careful and got the facts first. It does show that there's continuing concern about a conflict going on just outside NATO's borders, that things can happen that could escalate. But we've been very fortunate that officials have been careful and got the facts first.
NATO's chief also says the incident in Poland was likely caused by Ukraine's air defense systems. How likely is it for these missiles to go off track, to go rogue, if indeed that turns out to be what happened?
Unfortunately, this sort of thing is quite common. Remember, what goes up must come down. The Russians have been attacking with missiles the last couple of days. Ukrainians have been responding with their own air defense. These S-300s are missiles that they had before the war. NATO and the United States have also provided additional missiles and launchers. No doubt the Ukrainians have been firing a lot of these to try to intercept the Russian attacks. And one of these missiles, instead of self-destructing when it missed its target, just continued to fly and landed in Poland. Unfortunately, this happens quite frequently.
Is this incident just a footnote in this story, or is it a change of chapter? Does this happening change the narrative in Moscow and in Europe, Ukraine and the United States?
I don't think it'll change the narrative. This was a unfortunate mistake, an unfortunate accident. I think everyone's going to back off. The Russians, of course, have had this very conciliatory statement. The United States and NATO also backing off, not trying to exacerbate the crisis. I think, unfortunately, both sides are going to go back to where they were before with this ongoing conflict, with NATO in a very watchful posture, but not raising the level of activity.
Mark, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Mark Cansian speaking to us from Washington.
So how have the markets been reacting to this? Well, world stock markets fell overnight on reports of that missile in Poland, then recovered on news that the US President Joe Biden said it was probably Ukrainian in origin. And here in Europe, let's look at how the markets are reacting now. Well, a few moments ago, over in France, the CAC was down around 0.75%. Here in London, the FTSE also in the red, down 0.33%. And over in Germany, the DAX down 1.25%.
Well, the cost of food, fuel and heating in the UK has hit a 41-year high, with new figures showing inflation has risen to over 11% in the year to October. Speaking from the G20 in Bali, the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said tackling inflation was his #1 priority.
With more news of inflation today, it's the #1 thing that's on people's minds. It's the thing that's causing most anxiety. Opening up bills, seeing the emails come in with rising prices, and that's why it's right that we grip it. And tomorrow the Chancellor will set out a plan that will enable us to do that.
Well, here to take us through the numbers and what they mean for the UK economy is our correspondent Catherine Drew. Catherine.
Thanks, Robin. Yes, well, it's not news to UK households and businesses that prices are rising in shops and from suppliers. But a full percentage jump is more than analysts expected. Official data shows inflation for October hit 11.1% on the previous year, up from 10.1% in September and the highest rate since 1981. Now, the rise in the cost of living is being driven in part by energy costs, exacerbated by the Ukraine war. Over the past year, gas prices are up 130%, while electricity has also risen around 66%. Now, the cost of food is also a major factor, up 16.5%. That's a 45-year high. Staples such as eggs, milk, pasta, cheese, butter, they're all driving up the cost of living. Now, a couple of bright spots for the economy. Core inflation, which excludes food and energy, held steady at 6.5%, and new data shows wages are rising at their fastest rate in more than 20 years, although still well behind that rate of inflation. Now, all this is going to put pressure on the Bank of England to raise interest rates further to bring inflation down. Many believe a 50 basis point rise will be on the cards in December, raising the current rate from 3% and inflicting more pain on homeowners. Now, in the past hour, the Governor of the Bank of England has been telling MPs that further rate hikes are likely because of a tight labour market. Now, this raises the stakes even further for the government's autumn statement, which comes tomorrow, with Downing Street warning of deep cuts in public spending and tax rises for the good of the economy, which, let's remember, is on the brink of a recession. So this is going to be a very tough sell for businesses and households alike. Jamie, Robin.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed for that. Our correspondent, Catherine Drew. Well, Barclays Bank has cut its forecast for global economic growth in 2023 to 1.7%. That's down from its previous estimates of 2.2%. It says persistent high inflation will mean monetary policy needs to remain restrictive and that overall the year will be one of the weakest in decades. The United States economy is likely to shrink by 0.1% at estimates, while Chinese growth will be down at 3.8%.
Deliveroo is leaving Australia. The British food delivery company says it's no longer taking orders through its app and has entered voluntary administration. Deliveroo had come under pressure from the Australian government to treat its 15,000 riders as employees. It's also faced competition from rivals like Uber Eats.
New home prices in China fell 1.6% in October. This is the fastest drop in over 7 years and the 6th month of contraction. The authorities have ramped up support for the sector, announcing a rescue package to try to boost liquidity.
US cosmetics firm Estee Lauder has announced it's buying designer fashion house Tom Ford. The deal, worth $2.8 billion, is Estee Lauder's biggest acquisition to date. The luxury beauty company chased off competition from Gucci's owner to clinch the deal.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead.
We will be resisted by the combined forces of the establishment, the media, the special interests, the globalists, the Marxist radicals, the woke corporations.
He's back. The Donald declares he's running for president again in 2024.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
The former US President Donald Trump has announced he'll be running for the presidency again in 2024. He'd been signalling for weeks that he would declare his intention. He told supporters in Palm Beach that the entire US establishment would be against him, but he would win. Donald Trump has lost the support of parts of the Republican Party. Some blame him for their poor showing in last week's US midterm elections. Well, our correspondent Tony Waterman is in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. So, Tony, we pretty much knew this was coming, but were there any surprises in what Donald Trump had to say?
Well, Robin, I think one of the biggest surprises is that, at least in the front part of his 63-minute speech, he managed to stay on message. He really tried to trumpet what he sees as his accomplishments. He says that America was thriving when he was in power, and also that he built the strongest economy the world has ever seen. Some of those claimed accomplishments, though, were either simply untrue or greatly exaggerated. But as this speech progressed, it really morphed into what we now consider to be a more traditional Trump-type rally. He made these bombastic claims that what he called lunatic Democrats are destroying everything that he built. He also made these accusations that America now has these blood-soaked streets and cesspool cities. And he said that voters didn't really know how bad things are right now and how bad things are going to get, which is why, he said, the midterms, that red wave in the midterms, never materialized. Take a listen.
The Washington establishment wants to silence us, but we will not let them do that. What we have built together over the past 6 years is the greatest movement in history, because it is not about politics. It's about our love for this great country, America, and we're not going to let it fail. I am running because I believe the world has not yet seen the true glory of what this nation can be. We have not reached that pinnacle, believe it or not.
I think another thing that was quite surprising, Robin, is that he spent a fair amount of his speech talking about foreign policy, but that was also full of unsubstantiated claims, saying that if he were in power, that the war in Ukraine would have never started, and also insinuating that China interfered in the 2020 election, which, of course, there is no evidence to support.
And this time round, the race is going to be more challenging for him, isn't it? He's lost support from Rupert Murdoch and his Fox News network, and also has a serious challenger in the shape of the Florida governor.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I really think it is this New York Post front page that sums it up best. This is a conservative paper here in the United States, one of Rupert Murdoch's holdings, and it has really been a Trump cheerleader. But after this Tuesday night announcement, nothing, not a single mention on the front page of this paper. And in fact, in an online version, it just simply reads, "Florida man makes an announcement." That story found on page 26. Even his own daughter, Ivanka Trump, was not present last night at his announcement, saying that she is going to be steering clear of politics at the moment. This is really emblematic, I think, of this split that we're seeing within the GOP right now. You have Trump loyalists, about maybe 30% of the party, that 100% are supporting this presidential bid. But you have the broader Republican Party, some big-time donors, and the conservative establishment kind of signaling that it's time for a change, that Trump perhaps is bad for the brand, especially after the midterm elections, when you had several high-profile Trump-endorsed candidates losing their race. You have Republicans pointedly blaming Trump for those losses. And as you said, really since the first time since Trump wiped out his competition in the 2016 presidential race, we see that there are other viable candidates, most notably the Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis, who was the lone standout in the Republican Party last week.
Tony, good to talk to you. Thanks very much. Our correspondent Tony Waterman in Mar-a-Lago in Florida.
Let's stay in the United States, where retail sales have beaten forecasts with their biggest jump since January. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrace in New York. John, well, rather mixed signals, really, on the retail, on the shopping front.
I know. Big shock here this morning, 8:30 local time, when the news came out. Look, this is the Commerce Department in Washington, D.C., and they released these retail sales figures. And basically, it's a pulled together of durable goods and non-durable goods sold in shops and gas stations and garages and that sort of thing. So you could think of it as food to furniture. Okay, that's the easy way to think about it. We were all expecting it to be up about 1%, maybe even down a little bit, given all the news that we've been reporting on lately. It turned out to be up 1.3%, the biggest jump since January. People here in these posts at the stock exchange going, what just happened? We weren't expecting this. And it turns out that people have been buying autos and all sorts of other goods, which are now just coming through in these numbers. Now, the market slumped on this news, and at the moment, the Dow is up, but only by about 8 points, and the S&P 500 is down by about 20 points, and the Nasdaq is down. And of course, you know the reason for that, because this pushes back the chance of the Federal Reserve, the central bank, lowering the amount that it raises interest rates by on the 14th of December. Everyone here was hoping, because of all the news, that it will be a 50 basis point hike, not a fifth 75 basis point hike, and this pushes that further back. And it also raises the question, what on earth is going on over at Target, which we call Target. Target is a big box store. They'll sell you anything in a big box. It is a discount store these days as well. I have to say it's a very well-run American corporation. It's a nationwide chain, but their profit halved, 50% gone in these latest figures. And the boss there says that his customers are only buying the necessities. There's no fluff. They're not buying anything they don't actually need. He needs to save $3 billion to keep the store going, he says, and he's revised his forecast for the fourth quarter, which is the one that we're in at the moment. So as a result of that, Target shares are down very, very sharply, about 15% when I checked just a few moments ago. And it's in complete contrast to their rival Walmart, the world's biggest shop, and also Home Depot, which is a DIY store. They turned in some pretty good numbers only yesterday, with Walmart raising its guidance, not doing what Target has done, which is to lower it, and Home Depot saying we see no sign of people not wanting to go ahead and continue improving their home. So, I've said before on our program, we're in confusing times. This is all part of that.
John, there's an odd marketing story doing the rounds. Advertisers pulling out of Twitter. What's going on?
Well, this is very interesting indeed. We are told that the likes of Guinness, which go down very well in the New York area, where there's a huge Irish community, and Hershey's, which is the sort of American version of Cadbury's chocolate. There's a tie-up there. I have to say Hershey's is a very acquired taste, but that's just my opinion. And Nissan, which is one of the Japanese car makers, all of whom are stationed down in the south of the country, in places like Alabama and Georgia and Texas and places like that. These companies are being told, get your ads off Twitter. And the marketing execs are doing that. And it follows other companies who last week did the same thing and were told the same thing, like Pfizer, the big drug company, one of the vaccine producers in America, Audi, the German car company, and also General Mills, which is a huge food company. They are either cancelling their advertising contracts with Twitter or they're standing them down for the time being. Now, what's interesting about this is that we are told that rivals to Twitter, like Mastodon and Tumblr, are growing because people are switching from Twitter to Mastodon or Tumblr. I think this is very hard to believe. And seriously, Mastodon, you don't tweet, you toot. Tooting. Isn't that a place in South London? I think it is. I just don't see people going over to Mastodon or Tumblr in bigger numbers. And the reason for that is that Twitter is the forum for communication. So whether it's run by Musk or somebody else, it's where people go to have their say and hit back at their critics. And that's not going to change. And of course, Donald Trump, as our Tony was just telling us, is now running for the White House in 2024. And you've got to believe that he will be back on Twitter quite soon. You have to believe that.
John, we're surprised that you've ever been to Tooting or South London. You must have got lost. Thank you so much for that. John Terrace in New York.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. The climate talks in Egypt are given a boost by the G20's restatement of its commitment to keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But is it any more than hot air?
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation. We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live it out.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Poland's president says there's no sign of a deliberate attack from Russia after a missile killed 2 people on a farm near the border with Ukraine.
Our other headlines: the highest inflation rate in 41 years. UK households and businesses face a steep rise in prices driven by energy and the cost of food.
And leaders of the world's 20 major economies end their summit in Bali in a gathering overshadowed by Ukraine. China's president calls for the international community to work together to resolve the world's challenges.
UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has played down the prospect of any US trade deal in the near future after meeting President Biden on the sidelines of that G20 summit.
The two also discussed the war in Ukraine. Our correspondent Andrew Wilson reports.
The British Prime Minister had plenty he needed to discuss with US President Joe Biden, but the clouds of Ukraine hung over this G20 conference as they do over Europe. Rishi Sunak got his bilateral with President Biden, but from the start it was clear that the war in Ukraine would eclipse any talks about future trade.
Putin is striking civilian targets and children and women. I mean, it's almost, in my words, not yours, barbaric what he's doing. And Russia can and should stop the war. If they had to do it, they could stop it tomorrow if they wanted to. But I'm glad we're on the same page.
The Prime Minister could only echo the sentiments, but told President Biden he was optimistic that the UK and US could deepen their economic relationship in the future. Still, the two leaders have now met, and that is important for Downing Street. Rishi Sunak also faced questions about the UK economy and the Chancellor's autumn statement scheduled for Thursday.
Once we have that stable foundation, which the Chancellor will provide tomorrow, I'm confident that we can move forward as a country and we can look forward to a brighter future and build on that foundation to provide jobs and opportunity and prosperity around the country. But we need to get a grip of inflation first. We need to have that strong foundation.
It's reported that Joe Biden found time to express his concerns over the Northern Ireland Protocol and the broken stalemate in Belfast. Downing Street is said to have promised a resolution by the spring.
Mr. President, can you tell us what you know so far about the explosion in Poland, sir?
No. On the same day, the two leaders found themselves in an emergency session to discuss the recent strikes, an event that has rearranged the agenda for most of the G20 delegates. After Sharm el-Sheikh, Bali is Rishi Sunak's second outing on the world stage and another chance to rub shoulders in the turbulent world of international geopolitics. But while President Macron got his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the UK-China bilateral was cancelled at the last minute, according to Downing Street. He was able to meet Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Trade deals and visa programs will have been discussed. But uppermost on his mind will be that autumn statement due on Thursday. The world is waiting to see how the UK plans to rebuild its faltering economy. The American president took his leave swiftly post-summit. his teams have much to debate on the implications of the missile strikes, and they're unlikely to find time anytime soon to pursue that elusive trade deal that Downing Street so badly needs. Andrew Wilson, CGTN.
The United Nations climate talks in Egypt have been given a boost by the G20's restatement of its commitment to keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
And there was enthusiasm for a promise by Brazil's president-elect to reverse the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. Lula da Silva said he would ask the United Nations to hold the 2025 COP climate talks in the heart of the Amazon.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Yasser Hakim at those talks in Sharm el-Sheikh. Yasser, so we've seen strong words from the G20 in Bali about sticking to that target of 1.5 degrees of warming. How has that gone down at the COP talks?
Well, it can be the news that has changed the mood in Sharm el-Sheikh. Just yesterday, the mood was really down. There were no agreements in place. We're just a couple of days away from the last day of the conference, and there are still sticking points between developed nations and developing nations over the climate finance, of course, and the issue of loss and damages that was inserted in the agenda this year. And the news coming from G20 is probably putting some impetus, traction into these talks, as tomorrow, Thursday, is expected to be the last day for talks, so that all results will be announced on Friday. Now, will these statements in Indonesia or by the G20 actually translate into action and paper-written commitments in Sharm el-Sheikh? Now that will be what we will see in the next 24 to 48 hours, because the sticking points are still big between both sides, and we're waiting to see if this will change anything in the next few hours.
A lot of expectation around the arrival of Brazil's future leader-in-waiting Lula at the talks. What have we heard from him?
Well, he gave a speech that was really vibrant, enthusiastic. People were enthusiastic to meet him. That also changed the mood in today, adding to what the statements from G20. He said Brazil is back, and that I quote. And what he means is that Brazil is back again to fight for climate adaptation and to fight against climate change and to push the agenda again. Obviously, with the Amazon, it's considered the lung of the world, and the outgoing president was actually skeptical of all this environment policies and climate change. Deforestation was accelerating at 20% in 2021. 13,000 square kilometers of trees were deforested, and therefore he said that he's going to change this around. He said he will ask to host COP30 in 2025. He will bring together the DRC and Indonesia along with Brazil. Those three amount to 52% of the world's forests together, so that they can have one kind of unity, a unified policy to protect the climate, to protect the forests in these three nations. He's also said that the Amazon Fund that was included with Norway and Germany and has been suspended by the outgoing president Polisario, he will revive this fund, and Norway and Germany have agreed to do so. So he talked a lot about bringing back Brazil to the forefront of the climate change issues, but he also asked for or called for finance and investments from developed nations. So it's just back to the same questions that we're asking at COP27. Will the developed nations, the richer countries, the G20 be up to what they have promised? They have promised $100 billion a year before. It never happened. Now what are needed are trillions of dollars. Now he's saying, I'm going to revive the forest and the climate change issues for Brazil. Will the G20, the richer nations, also commit themselves to what he has called in his speech today? All this will be very clear in the next couple of days, and waiting to see what will happen there.
Yasser, thank you very much for that. Our correspondent Yasser Hakim in Egypt.
An oil tanker has been hit in the Gulf of Oman by what was reported to be an exploding drone. The Liberian flagged ship, which was bound for Argentina, suffered only minor damage to its hull. No one has claimed responsibility for the attack, which happened on Tuesday night. Israel has blamed Iran, while the Iranians accuse the Israelis of being behind the explosion.
The United Nations nuclear watchdog has called on Iran to start delivering information on its nuclear program. Its head, Rafael Grossi, accused Tehran of supplying answers that are technically not credible. Both sides will hold talks later this month.
Germany has completed its first liquefied natural gas terminal in a move to diversify its energy supply. The facility near the North Sea port of Wilhelmshaven is due to open in January. It's part of Berlin's push to become independent of Russian energy sources.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead, third time lucky. After 2 aborted missions, NASA launches its most powerful rocket yet from Florida to the moon.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. NASA has launched the most powerful space rocket in history from Florida. Artemis 1 blasted off from Cape Canaveral early on Wednesday.
Launch is NASA's first crucial step of returning astronauts to the moon 50 years after the final Apollo moon mission. No astronauts were on board this test flight, but it's hoped the crew will be on board for future missions.
Well, let's talk to Dr. Jennifer Millard, who's from the School of Physics and Astronomy at Cardiff University. Good to talk to you. So it's taken a while to get off the ground, this mission, hasn't it? But it is finally underway. What can we expect from it?
Yeah, we have had a few teething problems, but of course that's to be expected with a brand new untested rocket. But those have all been ironed out, and we are heading back to the moon with a crew capsule. So we haven't done that in 50 years. So with Artemis 1, as you say, it's just a dry run, a test. So we're going to get to the moon and enter lunar orbit on around day 10. We're going to swing around the moon a couple of times. We'll have some fantastic footage sent back from that because there are lots of cameras on board. And then around day 16, we'll leave lunar orbit and then head back to Earth. And that's when we're going to test that heat shield on the capsule. That's really, really key. And we'll splash down in the Pacific Ocean.
So what's the wider goal here? What's it eventually hoping to achieve or pave the way for?
So Artemis is all about going back to the moon, but staying there as well. So we're going to be exploring the moon with 50 years of scientific advancement, and that's 50 years of skill development, knowledge development, but also technology. And then while we're there, we want to be practicing for our next leap into the solar system, and that is, of course, Mars. Because we don't have the technology or the skills to send people to Mars today. That's what the Artemis program is going to prepare us for.
So some people might say that the money spent on this, which is adding up to billions of dollars, could be better spent on Earth. But how valuable do you think space exploration is?
It's an absolutely great question because, yeah, over approximately 15 years, the current estimate for the first 3 Artemis missions is about $93 billion, and that sounds like a huge amount of money. But if we just compare that to what the US spent on defence last year alone, that was $800 billion in 1 year. So $93 billion over 15 years is not so bad. And space exploration is so much more than just the big missions like Artemis and the James Webb Space Telescope. 90 to 95% of space exploration is space-to-Earth transfers, so that can be knowledge or technology. And that's all to do with, for example, GPS satellites, communication satellites, Wi-Fi, even climate modelling satellites. Most of our climate data comes from space satellites. So it is incredibly important. And of course, that goes without saying all of the spin-off technologies that we get from the big projects like Apollo, the International Space Station, and what we will get from Artemis.
Dr. Jennifer Millard, really good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's Dr. Jennifer Millard from the School of Physics and Astronomy at Cardiff University.
The Chinese and French presidents have held talks on climate change and the war in Ukraine as they met on the sidelines of the G20 summit.
On the same day, Paris hosted a China-France forum where discussions were held on a range of topics. Our correspondent Ross Cullen reports.
Tuesday was a big day for both countries and their bilateral relationship, following on from the meeting between Emmanuel Macron and Xi Jinping at the G20 summit in Indonesia. There, the two presidents discussed their strategic partnership, joint support for vulnerable economies, and a shared ambition to fight the climate emergency. Here at the China-France Forum in Paris, the Chinese ambassador to France said that Europe and China must focus on issues on which they align.
Nous soutenons une véritable autonomie stratégique de l'UE.
We support a veritable and autonomous strategy by the EU, and we oppose a Cold War mentality and the logic of confrontation between blocs. The EU sees China as a partner, competitor and rival, and we must be vigilant to negative impacts on the China-Europe relationship.
Also speaking at the forum, one former French ambassador to China said that the world needs to realise it needs to work with China, but that China also needs other countries to support its own development.
We are posing questions about China. This is why this type of forum is needed. Here we can say things, hear what the Chinese have to say, and we can ask questions as we are bound to be working together. China represents 18.5% of global wealth and a third of the world's economic growth. So it is in our best interest to keep working with China. And China, to help its growth, needs to keep working with the outside world too.
President Xi and President Macron also on Tuesday spoke about the war in Ukraine, with the French leader saying that Paris and Beijing are calling for respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. But some in the EU want China to go further and use its leverage with Russia to pressure Vladimir Putin into pulling his forces back from inside Ukraine. President Xi said that China's position on what it calls the Ukraine crisis is clear and consistent. China stands for ceasefire, cessation of hostilities and peace talks, and that the international community should create the conditions for those talks. The French president's office said that Macron has expressed, quote, deep concern over Russia's choice to continue its war in Ukraine. The consequences of this conflict, he said, go beyond European borders and must be overcome by close coordination between France and China. This forum, taking place on Tuesday on the same day as the president's meeting in Indonesia, showed how close the coordination is between the two sides. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Now, it was once a thriving, crowded community in Denver, Colorado. Then in 1880, a violent race riot wiped the city's Chinatown district off the map.
Now, a new film tells the story of that rather dark chapter and the modern-day Chinese-American community. Our correspondent Hendrik Sybrandy reports.
It's opening night for one of 200 films that make up the annual Denver Film Festival. This year's offerings feature a range of themes and topics. Tonight's film delves into a subject the city has never been eager to highlight until now.
You bet we're very, very excited.
Linda Lung is one of those who made reclaiming Denver's Chinatown happen.
There was a Chinatown. It was bustling.
The documentary recounts the history of Chinese Americans in Colorado, how Chinese immigrants, many of whom helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, first settled in frontier Denver, helped establish the working class section called Chinatown.
Denver had a Chinatown, and people don't know. People that were born and raised here have no idea that it existed.
Roxana Soto with Denver's Office of Storytelling produced the 51-minute film, which grew out of the desire of descendants of Chinatown residents like Lung to expose and explain this part of the city's history. This was the heart of Chinatown, Hop Alley, a derogatory term for the opium dens that were once located here and where the riot of October 31st, 1880 broke out. It began as a bar fight between some white men and two Chinese workers.
And within a few hours, there were hundreds and hundreds of Caucasian rioters that had descended upon the Chinatown, destroyed the businesses.
One young man was lynched. Chinatown was largely gone, but the anti-Chinese discrimination that fueled the destruction persisted well into the 20th century. Only now, with this year's formal city apology for the riot, the removal of an offensive plaque commemorating it, and this film, has Denver begun to come to terms with this part of its history.
We're always trying to provide a platform for marginalized voices, underrepresented voices, voices that are missing from the official historic narrative of the city. We always want to bring those forward. We're afraid that the story of Denver's Chinatown is getting lost, and we don't want that to happen.
That story was not easy to tell.
The hard part of doing like archival research, it's like there's nothing. There's like 5 pictures. I'll grab all of them. We got the privilege to be invited into these families' houses and to hear their stories, you know, spend lots of time with them.
She hopes this film helps the Chinese American community reclaim its role in the building of this city. A miniature Chinatown where this alley now sits is planned for the future. It's impossible to repair the damage that was done.
It doesn't repair, but I think that it's something that we can actually celebrate.
Because this is also a story of resilience all these years later. Henrik Sabrandi, CGTN, Denver.
Finally, Mariah Carey isn't getting what she wants for Christmas after the US Patent and Trademark Office torpedoed her attempt to call herself the Queen of Christmas. The pop star, known for such seasonal hits as All I Want for Christmas Is You and Silent Night, tried to claim that name but was blocked by Elizabeth Chan, who is known as the world's only full-time Christmas recording artist. Chan said it was wrong to try and monetize Christmas. The trademark would have given Carey the legal right to stop others from using the title on music and merchandise.
The headlines again. Leaders of the world's 20 major economies end their summit in Bali in a gathering overshadowed by Ukraine. China's president called for the international community to work together to resolve the world's challenges.
Poland's president says there's no sign of a deliberate attack from Russia after a missile killed 2 people on a farm near the border with Ukraine.
The highest inflation rate in 41 years. UK households and businesses face a steep rise in prices driven by energy and the cost of food.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow. Same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.